Welcome to this first webinar from the Society for Implementation Science in Nutrition. I'm David Pelletier, and it's my pleasure to be presenting this first webinar. The title is Implementation Science in Nutrition Towards a Common Understanding. A common understanding is critical. We in nutrition have discovered what other sectors have discovered as well. There are many multiple interpretations of what implementation science is, what it's for, what it looks like, what kind of research is involved. And going forward, we must develop a common language and a set of common concepts and a framework of implementation science for nutrition. This webinar is a start in that direction. So the goals for the seminar are to promote a common understanding of some core concepts in implementation science, provide an integrative framework for implementation science, and highlight the need for implementers and researchers to collaborate in order to achieve impact at scale. So the outline for the webinar is to first set the stage by describing the implementation opportunity and the challenge that we all face. Secondly, to provide some definitions, distinctions, and frameworks of implementation itself, implementation research, implementation science, and implementation knowledge. And finally, to provide an integrative framework for implementation science as developed by SISN. So in setting the stage, we're all aware that the attention and commitment to nutrition has never been stronger. Yet, we're also aware of the challenges we face in implementing and achieving impact at scale. One example of the attention and commitment is, of course, the SUN movement and the growth in the number of countries and organizations in the movement. Yet, this slide illustrates the challenges we face in making good on this opportunity. Among the countries with available data, we see that only a third are on course for achieving the stunting goal, the global stunting goal. And roughly half are on course for achieving the goal for wasting, for childhood overweight, and for exclusive breastfeeding. And perhaps most shocking, virtually no countries are on course for the anemia target among women of reproductive age, despite the availability of strong, efficacious interventions that we've had for decades. And finally, adult overweight and diabetes are already adding to the burden of nutrition in these very same countries. In a similar way, if we look at national coverage rates for key interventions, such as early initiation of breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months, introduction of semi-solid foods, vitamin A, oral rehydration, improved water, and improved sanitation, we see a tremendous range of national coverage rates for the countries for which we have data. And we would see an even greater range of variation and inequity within countries if we were showing data within countries here. Clearly, we have a long way to go in implementing at scale and with quality. Looking a bit deeper at the challenges, we can see that in the case of micronutrient powders or home fortification, there are bottlenecks at all stages of the process. From product registration and procurement to financing, supply chain management, health worker training and performance, and consumer understanding, acceptance, and utilization. A list of bottlenecks like this can be created for every one of our nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive interventions. That example illustrates that there's a need to open the black box of implementation in a systematic way for each intervention in each country or programmatic context. When we do that, we see that there are certain categories of factors that need attention. These are the characteristics, capacities, and dynamics in the implementing organizations, which includes frontline workers, supervisors, and managers. In the enabling environment, which involves the government, multiple ministries, funders, civil society, and the private sector. And there's also a need to firmly understand the characteristics, capacities, and dynamics of the clients, the households, and communities. Each of these, in turn, is a black box in itself, and I'll be opening them a little later in this presentation. The reality in nutrition implementation, however, is we typically are not sufficiently systematic in opening these black boxes when planning implementation. These two quotes from the literature illustrate this. Information dissemination alone, whether it's research literature, mailings, or guidelines, is an ineffective implementation method, and training, no matter how well done, by itself is an ineffective implementation method. Secondly, and this puts it most vividly, the train and hope approach to implementation does not appear to work. This really is quite sobering, considering the fact that training is the primary way in which we roll out programs. And the accumulated literature on implementation science from high-income countries as well as low and middle-income countries is that is not sufficient. And this is a quote that we hear over and over again. We know what to do, but we don't know how to do it. Here's an example that 97% of intervention evaluations in the Lancet paper 3 in 2008 were small-scale trials testing the efficacy of interventions. Yet only 3% of the studies that those authors could identify were testing effectiveness at larger scale. Yet, stunting can be reduced by 36% through high coverage of existing interventions. So this is the basis for another quote from the literature, that we're faced with the paradox of non-evidence-based implementation of evidence-based programs. We know what technical interventions are efficacious, but we don't have an evidence-based approach to implementing them. And this is really why SISN was formed, was to develop, promote, and support implementation science for nutrition. As I said earlier, developing this field requires some common understanding and key terms and concepts and frameworks, and getting agreement on those. And let's start by just being explicit about why we need a thoughtful framework for implementation science. Many of you may know, have heard of this expression, if all we have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If all we do is keep implementing the way we always have and doing research the way we always have, we will not be able to reach the global goals or national nutrition goals. Conventional notions of implementation may not include all the relevant decisions and processes that affect programmatic effectiveness, scale, and quality. There's a whole family of different decisions and processes that need support, knowledge support. Similarly, conventional notions of research may not meet the need of implementers in terms of the questions, the methods, the timeliness, and the dissemination. So we're in the situation that Einstein recognized many years ago, that we cannot solve our problems with the same level of thinking that created them. So the first concept to be clear about is implementation itself. The definition we're using comes from WHO. Implementation involves systematic and planned efforts within a system or organization to introduce and institutionalize a policy, plan, program, intervention, guideline, innovation, or practice, and ensure its intended effects and impacts. There are numerous things in this definition that need to be emphasized. It needs to be systematic. We're talking about introducing novelty into systems. We want to institutionalize it for sustainability purposes. And there are many objects of implementation, such as policies, plans, programs, interventions, and so on. And we want to do this in such a way that it achieves impact. Currently, we have a lot of implementation activity, but it typically falls short, especially with regard to being systematic, seeking institutionalization and sustainability, and gaining effectiveness. So to help us be more systematic, SISN has built upon some of the literature from implementation science to identify 5 domains that are relevant when planning and implementing. The first is to be clear on the objects of implementation. Each of these poses different challenges and has different requirements for being done well. And these will be familiar to you. We have nutrition-specific interventions, many types. And then we have nutrition-sensitive interventions, typically outside of the health sector. And then sometimes countries, 59 countries in the SUN movement, are trying to implement national multi-sectoral agendas, which is a whole nother level of complexity. Simultaneously, we have NGO projects, usually subnationally, which have different sources of funding, different timelines, different accountabilities, and that places distinctive requirements on them. And finally, we have implementation innovations, new practices, new ways of training or supervising health workers, new ways of mobilizing communities, new ways of doing advocacy, and so on. So these practices could be another object of implementation. So these need to be introduced into a black box of systems of implementing organizations, which include frontline workers, supervisors, and managers. All of that is affected by the enabling environment of the government, the funders, civil society, and the private sector. We need to be aware of the needs and the behaviors and dynamics and responses of individuals, households, and communities. And finally, the fifth domain are the implementation processes themselves. How do we initiate interventions? How do we do the detailed planning and design? How do we do the actual implementation, and how can we sustain these interventions? And the net result of all of these interactions is some impact on nutritional status. It's helpful at this point, I think, to relate this to another framework that we're very familiar with, which is the UNICEF conceptual framework of food, health, and care as the underlying causes of malnutrition. What that framework does is it tells us what to look at, to look and see if there are problems related to the food security, problems related to the health environment and health services, problems related to the care and feeding of young children, and focus attention on those problems, wherever the most critical constraints might be. And that's a good analogy for what we're proposing here, is that in moving forward with implementation, these are the domains that we need to look into, to assess, to see where there might be potential problems and address those problems. Now, bear in mind that the UNICEF conceptual framework has a great deal of complexity within each of those underlying causes. Food insecurity has a whole set of underlying causes which get quite complex. Likewise, the health system, likewise, the care and feeding of children. And so too do these 5 domains, as I'll show you in the next slide. But before going to that slide, it's important to be clear on its purposes. What I'm going to show you is a synthesis of roughly 40 factors that we already know from implementation science across many sectors and other countries affect the quality of implementation and impact. This synthesis is a goldmine of knowledge that we should put to use immediately in the way we do implementation, even before we talk about doing new implementation research. Many or most of these factors that I'm going to show you are not even on our radar screen when we plan implementation. Or if they are, we do not address them during implementation. So let us begin opening these black boxes. Here are the same 5 domains that I just showed you. There's not enough time to describe or explain the contents of each of these black boxes, but only illustrate them briefly. So with respect to the objects of implementation, think of nutrition-specific interventions for the moment. But there may be many different kinds of objects of implementation, as I mentioned. These may come from efficacy trials, and certain elements of those are considered core and others are peripheral. They might be adaptable to the context. The degree to which these are taken up by governments, by development partners, by frontline workers, by organizations at the subnational level depends on perceived and actual characteristics as shown here. So once these objects are introduced, or attempts are made to introduce them into implementing organizations, some adaptation is necessary in order to take account of the capabilities and opportunities within those organizations. But there are certain characteristics of the organizations that make a huge difference. The leadership, the commitment, the readiness, the management, the competing pressures and priorities, incentives, and so on. Similarly, there are characteristics of the staff, the frontline workers, supervisors, and managers concerning their knowledge, their skills, their beliefs, their motivation and incentives, their workloads, and so on. All of that determines the extent to which and how these interventions will move forward. The enabling environment has a huge influence on these implementing organizations, government and donor policies, practices, resources and regulations, the peer network influences, and the national, societal, and cultural influences, and the accountabilities and how they are maintained. Down at the bottom, individuals, households, and communities, we need to be really clear on what are their needs, their resources, their capacities, and a variety of social, cultural, behavioral, and economic and political factors that influence their response to interventions. Finally, in the fifth domain, we are promoting the view that there are 4 stages, if you will, of implementation processes that need much more systematic attention and that can be assisted through implementation research. This includes initiating, scoping, and engaging, and that's all prior to doing the detailed planning and design of interventions. And then there's the implementation, the actual on-the-ground implementation, making iterative improvements and scaling up over time. And then the commitment, support, financing, and sustainability, which is really a cross-cutting issue across all of the other stages. So again, the net result of all of this is some impact, hopefully good impact, on implementation outcomes and client outcomes. Now, what can we really do with this framework? I want to propose 4 things. Number 1, this helps us to be more aware of the real challenges and the real reasons for having low impact, much less impact and effectiveness than we would like. This really answers the question, why is it so difficult? Why is it so complex? It's important to face up to the reality of the complexity here. Number 2, it's important not to be paralyzed or put off by all of this complexity. We cannot and need not address all of these factors before implementation. Rather, we can use it as a checklist to identify the most critical bottlenecks, and we can adapt it by filling in the factors known to be most important in a given context. Third, this framework, or a contextually adapted version of it, can be the basis for implementers and researchers to have a productive conversation about the kinds of research most needed to improve implementation. Fourth, one of the most important domains for immediate and practical purposes is domain 5, implementation processes. It is within this domain where we can and should be more systematic in planning implementation and supporting it over time. And the 4 stages shown in domain 5 are all relevant. So now we can appreciate where implementation research fits in. The definition that we're using is implementation research is the systematic approach to understanding and addressing barriers to effective and quality implementation of health interventions, strategies, and policies, typically in specific contexts. This is an adaptation of the definition from WHO, and we would specify nutrition interventions, not health interventions here. So again, to highlight certain things, it's implementation research must be systematic. The purpose is to assess and address barriers. And the previous slide with the 5 domains helps guide the assessment, just as the notion of food, health, and care helps guide the assessment of malnutrition in the UNICEF conceptual framework. One of the reasons there are many interpretations of implementation research or implementation science is there are many types and purposes. And we've developed a classification to help organize this diversity and help us be clear on what research needs to be done for what purpose, when in the implementation cycle, and how. So one axis of the classification scheme is to be clear to distinguish the objects of implementation that one is concerned with, as I showed you earlier. The second axis is the 3 stages of the implementation cycle, from initiation and scoping, to planning and designing the interventions in detail, to the on-the-ground implementation, and cross-cutting is maintaining commitment, support, financing, and sustainability. This framework can help us to better understand what types of research or assessment or inquiry can be helpful at each stage of implementation. So let me give you some examples. In the case of initiation and scoping, what we're talking about is diverse forms of assessments, stakeholder analysis, opinion leader research, and consultations that can guide agenda setting, the identification of policy or program or intervention options, and their fit with the problem itself and the delivery capacities and the available collaborations and partnerships at the country level. In the case of planning and detailed intervention design, we can use diverse forms of formative research, which we're well aware of, that's very common these days, and consultations at multiple scales and administrative levels in order to guide the detailed design of policies, programs, interventions, and develop detailed implementation guidelines guided by explicit program impact pathways or theories of change. And here it's important in doing this planning to take account of some of the weaknesses or capabilities within the implementing organizations and the support that can be forthcoming from the enabling environment. With respect to on-the-ground implementation, there's diverse forms of operations research, special studies, process evaluation, quality improvement and quality assurance schemes, and monitoring and evaluation systems. And finally, there's cross-cutting governance functions that require diverse methods for stakeholder analysis, assessment of advocacy needs and opportunities, costing, capacity assessments, coordination, and so on. We are fortunate that we already have some examples in the literature for each portion of this classification. So let me just briefly go through these with you. And there's a list of references at the end of this presentation where you can look up the papers themselves and get a lot more information. So with respect to nutrition-specific interventions, we have an example of doing gathering stakeholder perspectives in Mexico prior to regulating school food. With respect to planning and detailed intervention design, there's a good example with calcium and IFA supplementation in Kenya. With on-the-ground implementation, there are good examples of IFA in Pakistan and the analysis of DHS data at the global level to identify the common places where IFA faltering occurs. With nutrition-sensitive actions, there's a great example of gathering stakeholder perceptions of nutrition-sensitive agriculture in East Africa prior to trying to introduce that into those countries. And with the planning and then the implementation, national flour fortification and landscape analysis of nutrition-sensitive agriculture in Senegal provide good examples. With respect to operationalizing a multi-sectoral nutrition agenda, there's a paper on intersectoral convergence in Odisha, India. And then there are examples of governance of multi-sectoral nutrition in Nepal and assessing progress and bottlenecks of multi-sectoral nutrition in Ethiopia and Nepal. With respect to NGO projects, multiple examples, including IYCF behavior change in Bangladesh, Mama Sasha of orange flesh sweet potato in Kenya, and IYCF foods in Kenya. And with respect to supporting on-the-ground implementation, we have HKI's homestead food production in Cambodia and examples of quality improvement cycles. Implementation innovations, a good example of home fortification or micronutrient powder delivery in Vietnam, assessing alternative models for delivery. The program assessment guide, which is an alternative way to identify bottlenecks, very systematic way to identify bottlenecks in large-scale programs. And going back to the top, we have two examples of prioritizing and funding the Uganda Nutrition Action Plan and nutrition leadership, drivers and constraints in 4 countries. So these are very helpful and illustrative of the kinds of research that can be used at different stages in the implementation cycle. And SISN is currently assembling many more examples from the literature, and of course many more exist in the gray literature. With that concept in mind, we can now bring things together and create and present a framework for implementation science itself. Implementation science, as we are seeing it and defining it, is related to but distinct from implementation research, as you'll see. First, let's acknowledge that we have a very real and practical problem with this whole construction. So if this is the definition of implementation research, a systematic approach for understanding and addressing barriers, given the complexity of implementation, which I've shown you when I've opened the 5 boxes in the 5 domains, and the many weaknesses that exist, we acknowledge there are many, many weaknesses in these 5 domains, and the inability of implementers to wait for research findings on each and every one of these. We have to conclude it is not possible to systematically assess and address all potential weaknesses within and between each of the 5 domains during all phases of the implementation process. So this is a bit puzzling. What are we to do? The practical solution is to draw upon implementation science and implementation knowledge. This is defined as an interdisciplinary body of existing theory, knowledge, frameworks, tools, and approaches whose purpose is to strengthen implementation quality and impact. It's not just new empirical research, it's the science of implementation. And there's already a good body of knowledge there. So let us look a bit more detail into this argument of tapping into implementation science and implementation knowledge. A great deal is already known about implementation from many different contexts, such that many of the most common mistakes could be prevented by applying current knowledge rather than undertaking new investigations. This is a very important and very critical observation. Much of this current knowledge has already been packaged into practical tools, frameworks, and guidelines that can be adapted and used in a variety of settings today. The greatest gap lies in knowledge utilization rather than in generating new knowledge. This knowledge utilization gap exists in nutrition, health, education, and most other sectors, and it exists in high-income countries as well as low and middle-income countries. It's the big implementation problem. So the most urgent need in nutrition implementation is to close this knowledge utilization gap by making these practical tools, frameworks, and guidelines more readily accessible, and through various forms of capacity building, technical assistance, coaching, knowledge brokering, and dissemination. And figuring out how to do this is a research agenda in itself, and a very important one. So we now are in a position to develop and present an integrative framework for implementation science that draws up upon all of the concepts that I've presented so far. The goal, as I've said, is to assess and address weaknesses in varied domains in a timely manner during all phases of implementation. There are factors that are known to affect implementation, many of them. We can achieve this goal or move closer to this goal in a more immediate and practical way by better using the frameworks, tools, and guidelines that already exist and linking this with capacity building, technical assistance, knowledge brokering, and coaching. And all of this draws upon existing knowledge about implementation and implementation science, which is still an emerging field, but a good deal is already known. So that is something that we can do immediately. That said, it's also important to acknowledge the vast reservoir of contextual knowledge and tacit and experiential knowledge that exists at country level and in program level about what works and what doesn't work in implementation. That needs to be made more explicit and more systematic so that we can build that knowledge of context into the planning processes rather than having wishful thinking. Secondly, there's the possibility and the need to do implementation research in the context in order to support specific decisions in that context. Now, this refers to practical implementation research, not the high-minded scientific rigorous trials, but practical implementation research embedded in and connected to implementation, such as stakeholder analysis, opinion leader research, formative research, rapid assessments, operations research, special studies, process evaluation, and so on. Both of these can contribute at country level and at global level to the emerging knowledge about implementation and how different contextual factors affect it. And then there is a third kind of research, formal and rigorously evaluated implementation trials, proofs of concept, and evaluation of innovative implementation practices, which can have potential applicability across many contexts. So this is a framework that has profound implications for implementers and their partners and for researchers going forward. It helps avoid this problem in the top right corner, that all we have is a hammer, and so everything looks like a nail. Specifically, it's important to now conceptualize an implementation knowledge portfolio in which there's these three major kinds of knowledge that are necessary, and we can draw upon them selectively in order to meet the needs of implementers in terms of the kinds of information needed and the timeliness, as well as the longer term needs that are better addressed by type 3 shown here. So to summarize, the high-level commitment to nutrition now creates an urgent need for large-scale implementation and impact. The window of opportunity may not last forever. Business as usual implementation and business as usual research is not sufficient. Both must change. And fortunately, good examples already exist. Third, the integrative framework presented here provides a way to improve the quality of implementation in a practical and timely fashion by systematizing, integrating, and using diverse forms of knowledge at all stages of the implementation process. And finally, SISN provides a mechanism for implementers, researchers, and other parties to collaborate in this effort. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found this helpful. Please send us your comments, your feedback, or suggestions through any of the venues shown here.